everyone. For learning outcome number 6 of Module 5, we're going to be covering the blood vessels that take oxygenated blood to the brain and then bring the CO2-rich blood from the brain back to the heart. There are a couple of blood vessels that supply oxygen to the brain. Let's start first with the internal carotid arteries. Remember that this artery is going to be a branch off of the common carotid artery. The other branch off of the common carotid artery is the external carotid artery that we can see on this image and over here as well. Notice how it runs on the outside of the skull and it branches several times to supply the blood to several areas of the face. Now the internal carotid arteries, we can't really see them on this image because they go inside of the brain and they will supply the arteries of the interior half of the cerebrum, as we can see right over here on the base of the brain. And the other arteries that supplies oxygen-rich blood up to the brain are the vertebral arteries, which are a branch off of the subclavian arteries that are these ones right over here that go then to the upper limbs. Now these will pass through the transverse foramen of the cervical vertebrae, as we can see right over here, and they will enter the skull on the posterior side through the foramen magnum. Remember the foramen magnum where the spinal cord also passes through? So that's the same area where the vertebral arteries will come through and enter into the skull. And once they reach the base of the brain, they will anastomose and form the basilar artery. Anastomosis is just a term that is used when there is a connection between two blood vessels. It can be between same blood vessel types, in this case, that we have, like an artery and an artery, or it can be a vein with a vein, or it can even be a connection between an artery and a vein. Like I said, in this case, both vertebral arteries, they will anastomose to give rise to the basilar artery that will then run anteriorly towards the pituitary gland, which is this little ball right over here. And around the pituitary gland, you will find the internal carotid artery anteriorly, the basilar artery posteriorly, and a few other arteries that will emerge and will have the word cerebral in them, and they will form this circle that's called the cerebral arterial circle, or the circle of Willis, which we can see will encircle the pituitary gland, more specifically the infundibulum of the pituitary gland. And with this arrangement, the brain can receive blood from either or both arterial sources, which are the carotids and the vertebrals. And the chances of a serious interruption of circulation are going to be significantly reduced, because if one part of the circle suffers stenosis, which as we know is a blockage or narrowing of the arterial wall, then the blood flow from the other blood vessels will be able to preserve the cerebral perfusion well enough to avoid the symptoms of ischemia, which is a restriction of blood supply to the tissue, which will then restrict oxygen delivery, which can result in tissue damage. And we definitely don't want our brain to suffer any tissue damage. Now, for decades, scientists have always associated the circle of Willis with this safety mechanism that prevents the blockage of blood flow to the brain. However, if we consider that the circle of Willis is also present in many non-human species like reptiles, birds, and mammals, and that the arterial narrowing is mostly associated with old age and human lifestyle, then this makes sense that there have been other functions suggested for the circle of Willis. Some of them are relating to dampening of the pulse pressure waves within the brain, and also there are some studies that show the involvement in the forebrain sensing of water loss, therefore another safety mechanism for our body. So on the previous slide, we were talking about the arteries, which are the ones that supply oxygen-rich blood to the brain. And now we need the blood vessel that will remove the waste products and the carbon dioxide from the brain back to the heart. So these will be the right and left internal jugular veins, which will pass through the jugular foramen. And then once they pass through the jugular foramen, you can see them coming down over here at the level of the cervical vertebrae or the neck, and it runs parallel to the common carotid artery. These internal jugulars, they will anastomose with the subclavians, as we can see over here, to form the brachiocephalic veins. You're going to have a right and left brachiocephalic veins that will anastomose and form the superior vena cava that will then drain the blood into the right atrium. And this is how deoxygenated blood reaches the heart coming from the brain.